Welcome back to Neural Battlefields, the channel where we don't just scratch the surface of history, we dig into the bones of it, pull out the uncomfortable truths, and lay them bare so the world can never forget. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and stay with us, because what you're about to hear is not just a history lesson. It is a reckoning. Today, we are talking about one of the most catastrophic, most deliberate, and most profitable crimes ever committed against human beings in the history of this planet. We are talking about the transatlantic slave trade, a system so deeply engineered, so ruthlessly maintained, and so shamelessly profitable that it didn't just reshape continents. It rewired the entire global economy, and the reverberations of it are still shaking the foundations of our world today. So sit down, take a breath, and prepare to confront the brutal truth. Let's set the scene. Imagine you are standing on the western coast of Africa, somewhere between modern-day Senegal and Angola in the year 1500. The air is thick and warm. Villages are alive with the sound of drums, trade, agriculture, and culture that stretches back thousands of years. These are not primitive people stumbling through darkness. These are societies with law, governance, religion, art, metallurgy, medicine, and commerce. Kingdoms like Mali, Songhai, Congo, Dahomey, and Benin are not footnotes in history. They are civilizations in the truest and fullest sense of the word. Now imagine a ship on the horizon. That ship does not come in peace, and the world that exists before its arrival will never, ever be the same again. The origins of what we now call the transatlantic slave trade are rooted in the Portuguese exploration of the African coastline in the early 1400s. Portugal, a small nation on the edge of Europe, was hungry for gold, hungry for spices, hungry for a route to Asia that bypassed the powerful Ottoman Empire, which controlled the overland trade routes from the east. So the Portuguese sailed south. And as they crept down the African coast, they began to encounter something that triggered not awe, not respect, not partnership, but greed. In 1441, a Portuguese captain named Antão Gonçalves returned to Lisbon with something that would ignite a catastrophe that lasted over 400 years. He brought back 10 African men and women, captured by force along the Mauritanian coast. He presented them to Prince Henry of Portugal, who we now call Henry the Navigator, as if they were exotic curiosities, as if they were trophies. Prince Henry was pleased. He sent Gonçalves back. And this time the mission was not just exploration, it was acquisition. By 1444, the first large-scale public auction of African enslaved people took place in Lagos, Portugal. Chronicler Gomes Eanes de Zurara, who was present, described the scene in haunting detail. He wrote about mothers clinging to their children, families torn apart at the whim of a buyer's hand, people weeping in a language no one around them understood. Even Zurara, a man of his time and loyalty to the crown, admitted that it was a spectacle of misery, and yet it continued. Because it was profitable. This is the first and most important thing you need to understand about the transatlantic slave trade. It was not born out of hatred alone. It was born out of profit. The hatred came later, manufactured to justify the profit. European merchants, monarchs, and colonists did not enslave Africans because they woke up one morning consumed by irrational malice. They enslaved them because it was economically advantageous. And then they built an entire intellectual and cultural architecture of racism to make it feel natural, divine, and inevitable. By the time Christopher Columbus bumped into the Caribbean in 1492, the Portuguese had already been trading enslaved Africans for over 50 years. Columbus himself, on his very second voyage to the Americas in 1493, brought enslaved people with him. But the demand for enslaved labor was about to explode on a scale no one had ever seen, because the Americas had something Europe desperately wanted: land. Endless, fertile, mineral-rich land. And land without labor is just dirt. The Spanish, who arrived in the Caribbean and Central America first, initially tried to enslave the indigenous populations, the Taino, the Arawak, the Aztec, the Inca. But within decades, The indigenous populations were being wiped out at catastrophic speed, not primarily through warfare, but through European diseases like smallpox, measles, and typhus, against which they had no biological immunity. Some estimates suggest that within 100 years of European contact, up to 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas had been killed. It was one of the greatest demographic collapses in human history. The colonial economy needed bodies to cut sugar cane under a scalding Caribbean sun, bodies to work silver mines in the Andes at altitudes that rupture lungs, bodies to plant tobacco in Virginia, harvest indigo in South Carolina, and pick cotton from Georgia to Mississippi. And so the eyes of Europe turned back to Africa. What followed was the construction of a triangle, a trade route so efficient, so coldly logical in its mechanics, that historians simply call it the triangular trade. Here is how it worked. European ships, British, Portuguese, Dutch, French, Spanish, Danish, loaded their hulls with manufactured goods: textiles, firearms, alcohol, iron bars, copper, beads. They sailed south and east to the coast of West and Central Africa. There they traded these goods with African rulers, merchants, and middlemen in exchange for enslaved human beings. These enslaved people were often prisoners of war captured during intertribal conflicts that the Europeans themselves sometimes deliberately aggravated and fueled in order to generate a steady supply of captives. They were also kidnapped in raids, taken from their homes, their families, their entire worlds, in the middle of ordinary days that began like any other day. From Africa, the ships turned west and crossed the Atlantic Ocean. This crossing is known by a name that should make your blood run cold every time you hear it: the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage was not a journey. It was a systematic process of dehumanization engineered with mercantile precision. The enslaved people, men, women, children, the elderly, the pregnant, were packed into the lower decks of the ships in conditions that defy the imagination. They were shackled, wrist to wrist and ankle to ankle, lying on wooden shelves with sometimes as little as 45 centimeters of vertical space between them and the plank above. They could not sit up. They could not turn over comfortably. In many configurations, they could not even fully extend their limbs. The journey across the Atlantic took anywhere from 3 weeks to 3 months, depending on winds and weather. In that time, the enslaved were brought up to the deck in small groups for brief periods of air and forced exercise, what the crew called dancing, to keep their bodies functional enough to be sold. The rest of the time they lay in darkness, in the stench of their own bodies, in the excrement and vomit and blood of the people chained beside them. Disease tore through the holds with apocalyptic speed. Dysentery, smallpox, typhoid. There were documented cases of people going mad from the conditions. Some threw themselves overboard when given the chance, choosing the ocean over whatever came next. The mortality rate on the Middle Passage was staggering. Estimates suggest that between 15 and 25% of enslaved people died during the crossing alone. When you consider that somewhere between 12.5 million and 15 million Africans were loaded onto slave ships over the roughly 400 years, the trade operated. That means between 1.8 million and 3 million human beings died on those ships and were thrown into the Atlantic Ocean. The ocean floor of the Middle Passage route is, in a very real and very horrible sense, a graveyard. Now here is where the calculation becomes even more sickening. The slave traders knew the mortality rates. They factored them into their profit models. They even took out insurance policies on the enslaved people they were transporting, treating them in their ledgers and legal documents exactly as they would treat any other commodity: a bale of cotton, a barrel of rum, a chest of silver. There are historical records of slavers throwing sick enslaved people overboard mid-voyage to claim insurance money, rather than having them die on the ship and be counted as a loss by other means. The Zong massacre of 1781 is perhaps the most infamous of these cases, where 132 enslaved Africans were thrown into the sea alive by the ship's captain, Luke Collingwood, for insurance purposes. The subsequent legal case was not tried as a murder. It was tried as an insurance dispute, because in the eyes of British law at the time, those 132 people were property, not people. Let that sit with you for a moment. After the Middle Passage, the surviving enslaved people arrived in the Americas. In the Caribbean, Jamaica, Barbados, Haiti, Cuba, or in Brazil, or along the eastern coast of North America. Here they were subjected to what was called seasoning, a word that sounds innocuous and is anything but. Seasoning was the process by which newly arrived enslaved Africans were broken physically, psychologically, spiritually, into total submission to the plantation system. It involved brutal labor under lethal conditions, punishment for any sign of resistance, the systematic dismantling of language, culture, and identity. Enslaved people were forbidden from speaking their native languages. They were given new names, English, Spanish, Portuguese names chosen by their enslavers. They were forbidden from practicing their traditional religions in many territories. In many colonies, it was illegal to teach an enslaved person to read. The logic was simple and monstrous. A human being who knows who they are, where they come from, what they believe, and who their people are, that human being is dangerous. Strip them of all of that and you have a tool. The plantation system that emerged from this was one of the most profitable economic engines in human history. Sugar became the oil of the 17th and 18th centuries. A single sugar plantation in Jamaica or Barbados could generate profits that would be equivalent to tens of millions of dollars in today's money. The enslaved people who worked those plantations, who cut cane from before sunrise until after dark, who operated the boiling houses where sugar was processed at temperatures that regularly caused severe burns and accidents, who died at such rates that the plantation owners found it more economically efficient to simply work enslaved people to death and buy new ones rather than provide adequate food, shelter, and medical care. Those people received nothing. Not a wage, not a right, not a name that was truly their own. Brazil received the largest number of enslaved Africans of any single destination, approximately 4.9 million people over the course of the trade. The Caribbean collectively received around 4.7 million. The colonies that would become the United States received somewhere between 400,000 and 500,000. This might seem surprising given how Central American slavery is to historical memory. But the reason the enslaved population in North America grew so dramatically, from roughly 700,000 at the time of the first American census in 1790 to nearly 4 million by 1860, is that the conditions on North American plantations, while unspeakably brutal, were not quite as lethal as the sugar economies of the Caribbean and Brazil, which consumed people like fuel. The third leg of the triangle was the return voyage. The ships that had carried enslaved human beings across the Atlantic now filled their holds with the products of enslaved labor, sugar, tobacco, cotton, rice, indigo, rum, and sailed back to Europe, where those goods were sold at enormous profit. This profit funded banks. It funded universities. It funded the construction of cities, the capitalization of industries, the financing of wars. The slave trade was not a sideshow to the development of the Western world. It was a foundational pillar of it. Scholars and economists have traced the connections with devastating clarity. The city of Bristol in England was built substantially on slave trading profits. So was Liverpool, which was the busiest slave trading port in the world by the mid-18th century. Lloyd's of London, today one of the world's most famous insurance markets, built much of its early business insuring slave ships. Barclays Bank has acknowledged that its founders were involved in the slave trade. The wealth generated by slavery helped finance the Industrial Revolution in Britain, providing the capital for machinery, factories, and infrastructure that transformed Europe, and by extension, the modern world. In the United States, the economic entanglement was even more direct. By 1860, the enslaved people of the American South represented the largest single capital asset in the entire American economy, worth more than all the railroads and factories in the country combined. Cotton, grown almost entirely by enslaved labor, was the most valuable export commodity in the country and was deeply woven into the supply chains of textile mills in New England and in Britain. The phrase "King Cotton" was not a metaphor. It was a description of raw economic reality. And what about the resistance? Because here is something that does not get said loudly enough in these conversations. The enslaved people did not accept their condition. They did not submit quietly into the machinery of their oppression. Throughout the entire history of the slave trade and slavery as an institution, there was resistance. Constant, creative, courageous, and often deadly resistance. On the ships themselves, there were revolts. Over 500 documented shipboard rebellions have been identified by historians. In 1839, the enslaved Africans aboard the Spanish ship Amistad, led by a man named Seng P., known in American history as Joseph Cinque, seized control of the vessel. Their case eventually reached the United States Supreme Court and became a landmark moment in the abolitionist movement. On the plantations, resistance took 1,000 forms. It was the deliberate slowing of work, the subtle sabotage of equipment, the poisoning of food. It was the preservation of African languages in secret, the maintenance of spiritual practices under the cover of Christian worship, the creation of music and storytelling traditions that encoded memory and resistance. It was escape, the desperate, dangerous flight toward freedom that gave rise to institutions like the Underground Railroad in North America. It was outright uprising. The Haitian Revolution stands alone in human history as the only successful slave revolt that resulted in the founding of an independent nation. Beginning in 1790, one in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, what is now Haiti, the enslaved population, inspired by the ideals of the French Revolution while being brutally excluded from them, rose up in the largest and most successful slave rebellion the world had ever seen. Under the leadership of figures like Toussaint Louverture and Jean-Jacques Dessalines, they defeated not just the French colonial forces, but armies sent by Spain and Britain as well. In 1804, Haiti declared independence, becoming the first black republic in the history of the world and the first nation in the Western Hemisphere to permanently abolish slavery. France's response to this triumph of human dignity was to demand reparations, not from the slaveholders who had committed atrocities against the Haitian people, but from Haiti itself, for the loss of their enslaved property. France demanded 150 million gold francs as the price of recognizing Haitian independence. This debt, this ransom paid by a free people to the nation that had enslaved them, crippled Haiti's economy for over 100 years. Haiti did not finish paying this debt until 1947. 143 years of payments, made by a nation born in triumph but chained in debt. The abolition movement, when it finally gained traction, was driven by a combination of forces. Moral and religious conviction played a significant role. Quakers were among the earliest and most consistent opponents of slavery in the English-speaking world, and evangelical Christians in both Britain and the United States made abolition a central cause. Enlightenment philosophy, with its emphasis on natural rights and human dignity, provided the intellectual framework. The testimony of formerly enslaved people like Aloda Equiano, whose autobiography published in 1789 became a sensation in Britain and helped shift public opinion, gave the movement its moral urgency and its human face. Britain abolished the Transatlantic Slave Trade in 1807 through the Slave Trade Act. But note the distinction carefully. This abolished the trade, not slavery itself. British colonists could still keep the enslaved people they already owned. Full emancipation in British colonies did not come until the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833, which came into effect in 1834. And when it did, the British government paid £20 million in compensation. Not to the enslaved people, to their enslavers. That 20 million pounds, equivalent to roughly 300 billion pounds in today's money, was borrowed by the British government. The loan was so large that British taxpayers were still paying it off until 2015. So if you are a British citizen, your taxes were paying compensation to slaveholders within living memory. The United States formally ended the transatlantic slave trade in 1808, but slavery within American borders continued and expanded brutally until the conclusion of the Civil War and the passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865. Even then, the end of legal slavery did not mean the end of the system built on it. What followed was a century of Jim Crow laws, sharecropping systems that recreated near-slavery conditions for black agricultural workers, systematic denial of education and voting rights, convict leasing programs that used the prison system to force black Americans back into unpaid labor, and racial terror in the form of lynching and organized violence. The legacies of the transatlantic slave trade do not live only in history books. They live in the wealth gaps between communities. They live in the health disparities documented by researchers across the United States, the United Kingdom, Brazil, and the Caribbean. They live in the political structures of nations whose founding documents spoke of universal liberty while their economies ran on human bondage. They live in the soil of the American South, where fortunes were made, and the people who made them received nothing, not even the dignity of their own names in the records. The transatlantic slave trade transported approximately 12.5 to 15 million Africans across the ocean over roughly 400 years, from around 1500 to the final years of the 19th century, when Brazil, the last major slave-importing nation, finally abolished slavery in 1888. Of those millions, scholars estimate that 1.8 to 3 million died during the Middle Passage alone. Millions more died during capture in Africa, during the forced marches to the coast known as the coffles, and during the brutal process of seasoning in the Americas. When you account for the full demographic impact on West and Central Africa, the population loss, the destabilization of societies, the disruption of political structures, the economic drain, some estimates suggest that the continent lost upward of 60 to 100 million people, either directly or through the cascading generational effects of the trade. This is not ancient, abstract history. The youngest survivors of American slavery were alive within the lifetimes of people who are alive today. The grandmother of someone you might pass on the street may have known someone who was born enslaved. This is not the distant past. It is the recent past, and its wounds are not healed. What do we do with this knowledge? That is the question that this history ultimately forces upon us. And it is not a comfortable question, because the honest answer involves looking at who benefited, who still benefits, and what, if anything, is owed to those whose labor and lives built so much of the modern world without receiving any of its returns. The conversation around reparations is complex, politically charged, and far from settled. But the conversation itself, the willingness to have it, to say these words clearly, to stop euphemizing and sanitizing and abstracting the horror, that is where understanding begins. The transatlantic slave trade was not a historical footnote. It was not a regrettable but inevitable byproduct of its time. It was a choice, made again and again over centuries by specific people, for specific reasons, with specific and knowable consequences. It was a system built on the calculated reduction of human beings to units of economic value. It was one of the most profitable enterprises in the history of the world, and it was built entirely on human flesh. The people who were enslaved were not victims defined solely by their victimization. They were engineers and farmers, mothers and fathers, kings and scholars, storytellers and musicians. They were human beings in the fullest, richest, most irreducible sense of that word. And what was done to them? What was done to millions of them over generations, across continents and oceans, deserves to be spoken of clearly, accurately, and without flinching. because history that is softened becomes history that is forgotten. And history that is forgotten has a terrible, relentless habit of repeating itself. This is neural battlefields. We do not look away from difficult truths. We believe that understanding the past, however brutal it may be, is the only honest foundation for building something better. If this video opened your eyes, challenged your assumptions, or gave you something to think about, then it did exactly what it was meant to do. If you found value in this documentary, please take a moment to like this video. It helps more people find this content and ensures that these stories continue to be told. Share it with someone you think needs to hear it. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Neural Battlefields because we are just getting started. History has 1,000 more secrets buried beneath the surface, and we intend to dig up every single one of them. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being willing to sit with this, and we will see you on the next battlefield.